If there's no inherent meaning, that means then my own experience of my sexuality becomes what is ultimately important to me. And if there's no meaning outside of me or outside of us to tell us, then that means that no one really outside of myself can tell me or instruct me or evaluate the experiences I'm having to say whether they are good or bad one way or the other. You're listening to the Prepared to Answer podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And just a reminder that all of the resources that we mentioned in this episode today, you can find linked through the episode description.
Welcome to another Prepared to Answer podcast. My name is Shawn Walker. I'm joined by Scott Steen as always. How are you, Scott?
Good, Shawn. Good to see you.
And for those watching on YouTube, Scott's got a vintage Star Wars comic book shirt. So this is the debut for this episode.
Yes, this was a Father's Day present for my daughter.
Very nice.
It's the cover for the first edition of the Star Wars comic book that I believe came out back in 1977 when the movie came out.
Cool. So we're hoping that will entice some of our audio listeners to jump onto YouTube and check out what Scott's wearing. It's cool.
If for no other reason than to look at my t-shirt.
Yeah, that's right. Well, we want to welcome our listeners back to our podcast. And we're changing gears, Scott. We're going from the hard teachings of Jesus to something completely different.
Yeah, well, we came out of the hard teachings of Jesus. Now we're just going to jump into some hard subjects, period.
Yeah.
In this series, we're going to be spending the next several episodes, Shawn, diving into the subject of sex and sexuality, something that is certainly, certainly on the forefront of our cultural imagination, but especially for us within the Christian community, it is a subject of growing and ongoing concern. For so many reasons. And of course, it's a huge topic, so we're not going to be able to cover everything. But there were just a few subjects and ideas that I was thinking through over our summer break, Shawn. Just some matters that I thought would make good conversation, for you and I to just dive into, as well as that would actually move in the direction of some of the content that we have been producing and some of the content we're going to be delivering early in the new year. Maybe we'll mention that in a little bit. But for this series, really, you know what? It's just such an important subject for us as Christians, and I really want to help us get our mind around it biblically, because I think that's just becoming more and more important for, the day-to-day ebb and flow of Christian discipleship. It's just we face it in the culture all the time. We need to be informed and thinking biblically. As here Prepared to Answer, our goal is to help Christians think biblically about all of life. And sex and sexuality is no exception, certainly in our day and age, maybe even more important to take the time to think carefully about.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I would be remiss not to remind our listeners of is to like, share, and subscribe. We're encouraging everyone to share what we're doing, to kind of spread the word on what we're talking about. And this is, like you said, Scott, this is a huge topic, sex is. We've got, I think we're looking at 4 episodes for this topic. So, of course, we are only going to kind of scratch the surface on some of these topics. But like you said, we're going to make reference to some content that we're looking forward to coming out in the new year that will dive a lot deeper into these subjects. And we're really hoping not only individuals, but churches, youth groups, small groups could pick up some of this material, because it's so relevant to what is happening in our culture right now.
Yeah, and certainly, just thinking about it, Shawn, too, is this is not the first time we've addressed these subjects either. Mm-hmm. So we'll be pointing backwards as well to some of the content that there already is on our website and on our YouTube channel. So, they can, and our podcast also.
Yeah. So where do we start on the subject of sex? Huge subject. Why are we doing it, Scott? What are we going to be touching on?
Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think more broadly speaking, we want to help Christians in this ongoing discussion that's happening within the culture and certainly within the church on sex and sexuality. And what we would really like to be able to do and what we're working to do is to just help provide Christians with more clarity and I think a little more confidence to address the subject biblically, to understand, what the Bible teaches about sex, and also understanding a little more clearly, well, what is it that our culture really believes? Hopefully getting a better understanding of both those things, then Christians will just in general be better equipped or feel more equipped to engage in productive conversations on the subject, whether it's with other believers that we may be running into disagreements on, whether it's members of our own family or just the people in the world around us who we want to bear good and faithful witness to, in all areas, but certainly in the subject of sexuality, that we would bear a confident biblical witness. That doesn't mean the world's going to like what we have to say. But again, at the end of the day, if I am being faithful to God's word, that's ultimately my only concern.
Right.
Yeah.
So maybe a good place to start, Scott, is now, I'm younger than you are, but it feels like
yes, you're a pup, all right. Yes.
Yes, it feels like society, culture, things we hear and see. It seems like there is more sex, more emphasis on it than in the past when we were growing up. Is it just that I am getting older and feeling that?
You are getting older. There's no question. Yes. When I talk to your kids, it sounds like you're getting older.
Yes.
Yeah, you know what? We could sit here and reminisce a little bit, Shawn, and I don't want to date ourselves too much. But when I think back to, even in television, when I think back to when I was a young person and what was considered risque, right, on primetime television, it's like they put that on the family options on the Disney Channel and those kinds of streaming services. Those are considered tame, compared to today.
Right.
And
so is it just my perception? Is it just me perceiving it? Or do we know, is there anything that would actually say that is the case, that, television, media, whatever is becoming more sexualized now than what it's been in the past?
Yeah. Just to say it just sounds like, we sound like a couple of fuddy-duddies who are longing for the old days, right?
Exactly.
No, interesting. Anecdotally, I think we all get it. We all walk through the grocery store checkouts and we see Cosmopolitan magazine that used to be a fashion magazine. And now it's basically, it's all about, sex techniques. And that's in the grocery aisles. Some interesting data that I did find, though. Now, of course, people don't watch television the way they used to. The whole cable access to television networks, that's kind of by the wayside. Most people anymore stream their TV watching through Netflix or Prime or whatever, or Hulu or other streaming services. But not that long ago, and this is a report that came out in 2013, but the data dates to 2005. And at this time, it was still tracing the trajectory of cable television. So, your regular cable TV content, which again, we're just streaming it. So it's the same content, but it was just consumed differently.
Yeah.
But this report actually it was summarizing just in general the sexual content in primetime TV. And it surveyed about 700 and something television programs, and it compiled all the data. So what it found was, going back to 1998, it said that the percentage of programs with any sexual content, right? So that's just, whether it's depictions of or allusions to or conversations around, 56% of all TV programming had some form of sexual content. Yeah. By 2002, that had jumped to 64%.
Yeah.
So there's a 4-year jump, and it goes up to 64%. Just 3 years after that, 2005, it jumped up to 70%. So at least the data in terms of just our television consumption, the content of sexual content in our media is doing this, and that's just in our television entertainment. And certainly I think the same could be true about movies and all of the rest.
Yeah. So, when we were growing up, there wasn't the internet, but certainly the internet has now added a whole new dimension to it. In fact, you were sharing some stats, and I'll give some stats. It just kind of blew me away in terms of porn stats on the internet. So this is according to data from SEMrush Traffic Analytics, saying as of May of 2021, porn sites received more website traffic in the US than Twitter, Instagram, Netflix, Pinterest, and LinkedIn combined. That's insane.
Which is incredible.
That's insane.
Those are like the largest platforms for media consumption.
Right. Evidently not. They're not the largest platforms for consumption.
Second to then, yes.
Second to
the porn industry.
Yeah. And this one got me too. 25% of all Google searches are related to porn. So
not just Google, any search engine.
25% is nuts. 70% of men aged 25 to 34 have viewed a porn site in the last month, which is just crazy. And then the growth in female-oriented porn sites has grown 1,400% since 2013. So this isn't only just a male thing.
Right. Kind of breaks the stereotype that this is just a male problem. But no, more and more there's reporting on porn addiction among men and women.
Yeah. So is this just like a moral laxity, that we're getting more lax in our morals? Is this really what these numbers are telling us?
Yeah, well, I think the question is, why does it seem that our culture is, our preoccupation with sex seems to be accelerating?
Right.
Why is that? And I think it would be easy to just say, what's happening here is this is just moral laxity. You know what? We've just allowed the line to be redrawn and redrawn. We just keep, making concessions, and just a little bit of time. It's like the frog in the kettle, right?
Yep.
And all of a sudden, you make an allowance back in the 70s and 80s, and now look where we are.
Yeah.
I think that would be an easy answer to give, but I think that's maybe descriptively helpful.
What do you mean by that?
But I think that's probably a fair description of what we feel like is happening. Is that it's moral laxity, that we keep making concessions, and that the standards keep just moving, or the line keeps moving. Yeah. But I don't think that explains what's happening.
Okay. So that's not the reason, the cause, you're saying?
Well, no, I don't think it's just, moral laxity, as if, what we need is just for good common sense of the North American public to kick back in, and we'll suddenly realize that we need to put some boundaries around these things again for our own good. Yeah. I don't think that's what's happening, and I don't think that's going to really do it.
Okay.
And the other thing I think to realize is that this preoccupation with sex, it's not like it's unique to our era. Right?
Okay.
This isn't a uniquely 21st century problem. I think we think it is because we tend to view history maybe through the lens of the Victorian era,
right?
When the kind of the real tight sorts of moral restrictions around propriety and all those things came into effect. But you just think, go back to ancient Hindu culture, you find things like the Kama Sutra, right? These ancient texts, which arguably you could say, well, there's a good example of ancient porn,
right,
where there are depictions of and explanations and instructions on tantric sexual rites,
right.
But even going to the Bible, Shawn, you look at the New Testament, you look at the kinds of things that particular Paul was writing to the New Testament church. The Greco-Roman world was saturated with sexuality, particularly around the Greco-Roman mythology of their gods, the worship of their deities. Cult prostitution was part of the communal life of of society, in terms of how worship was done and how things were conducted at the temples. Those were the worship spots of the day.
Right.
So, so the question is, so is this just more of the same?
Yeah. Are we just, a different version? We've got the internet, they had the Kama Sutra, is it just more of the same?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes and no.
You sound like a politician.
Yeah, more and more so I'm finding. Oh, just give me a straight answer. Why don't
Come
you?
on,
No.
Steen. Just tell it like it is.
Here's the straight answer. Maybe.
Yes, maybe.
No. So yes, in the sense that even, back in those days, yes, those sexual practices also fell outside of God's will for, the holy use of our bodies, what he intended our bodies to be used for. But I would say no in the sense of what governed these practices.
Okay.
Right. So yes, we see the same kinds of practices happening today as happened in ancient society. But I think what governed them or what drove them has changed. And in other words, I would say what's changed is the worldview behind them.
Okay. I never thought we were going to get to worldview and sex. That those two would collide at any point, but
they absolutely do.
Okay.
Nancy Pearcey wrote a fantastic book called, and I think we've quoted it before, called Love Thy Body. It's essentially a good biblical theology of the body. She writes in it, and she says something that I think is absolutely correct. She says that the problem is, and she's speaking to us, the problem with us in the West, even Christians, the way we think about things. The problem is that we think about morality, and I would argue, I would add in there especially sexual morality. We think about morality as a list of rules, things that we should and shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. She says, but in reality, every moral system rests on a worldview. Mm-hmm. In every decision we make, she says, we're not just deciding what we want to do, but we're deciding and expressing our view on the purpose of human life. And I think she's exactly right. And so here, Shawn, here's an example to say what I'm trying to get at is seeing that, well, yes, we look at our present day culture and the practices, the kinds of things that are being, practiced and allowed and even encouraged. You look at ancient, which is the Greco-Roman world, or ancient Hindu tantric sexual rites. The same kinds of behaviors are happening.
Right.
But the worldview behind them has changed.
Okay.
And so here's an example that there was actually a worldview behind, ancient Hindu tantric sexual rites. So, for example, this is on the Kama Sutra. I found this on BritishMuseum.org, an article about the Kama Sutra and the beliefs behind it. It says that, according to Hindu belief, the creation of the universe is believed to be the product of divine sexual union. So Tantra, that is the sexual rites that the Kama Sutra promotes, right? Mm-hmm. Tantra, rather than seeking pleasure as an end in itself, taught practitioners to harness the body and sensuality in order to unite with divinity and attain transformational power in their lives.
Wow.
So that just, I think that illustrates nicely what we're trying to get across here, is that what we do with our bodies is absolutely an expression of what we believe to be true about the nature of the world, about our worldview.
Right.
So for the Kama Sutra, it wasn't just about, kicks. It wasn't just like our modern porn today. It had a spiritual dimension to it. It had a religious dimension to it. So it was sex, albeit it was immoral. It was against what God has designed for us. Mm-hmm. But the purpose of it was beyond the sexual acts themselves. It was another, to get somewhere else.
Right. And that would be the same for Greco-Roman, I assume, in the cultic practices.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, that whole theme of divine fertility is very common throughout all pagan spirituality, because there's this sense of connectedness to the fertility, where the universe is fertile, the gods produce, they're the ones behind the fertility of the, everything we have around us. And so what our quest as humans, right, as mortals, is to align ourselves with the programs of the gods so that we can basically control our environment and make sure that we have, the kind of fertility and productivity that we need to survive.
Right.
It's all tied together to those religious beliefs.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So I think we need to modify the question somewhat beyond just asking why does our culture seem so preoccupied with sex, to asking why does it seem that our cultural preoccupation with sex, why does it seem to be so much more intense? and divisive and arguably destructive. And why do we continue? We're seeing an acceleration of it, right? As the data shows, it's just accelerating, and it doesn't show any sign of letting up. So I think it changes the question somewhat, and honestly, it does take us. It takes us in asking that question. I think we do need to go and address the issue of worldview, because that's where I think we will find some understanding, and insight, of what's going on around us and why.
Yeah. Okay. So probably best place to start is, what is our current worldview and how has it been informed? And in fact, probably longtime listeners have probably heard us talk. Some of these names will be familiar, Scott, as we kind of quickly walk through this.
Yeah, we're going to drop some names that are probably familiar to most people. If they're not, I mean, it's not like you have to have a broad knowledge of them. These are names that just represent formative ideas that have very much captured our culture's mindset. And I mean, what's our worldview today? Well, living in a pluralistic society, there's so many diverse perspectives, we could say. But in the West here, we are still very much shaped by, the worldview of secularism, and looking at the broad movements of Western thought over the last at least 2 or 3 centuries. What we're seeing happening today is due to, in large part, what I see as 2 major worldview shifts that have happened over the last, I would say, again, a couple hundred years.
So this is a move away from the Judeo-Christian worldview.
Right. So if we in general could say that Western culture has been, by and large, the worldview has been shaped by Judeo-Christianity, right? Judeo-Christian beliefs for, since the era of the advent of Christianity in Rome to, its movement across Europe and Western Europe and Eastern Europe even, and then moving across to North America. So the West has very much been shaped by a Christian worldview until very recently. But even in that, there's been this shift over time away from a Christian worldview. And I think 2 significant shifts have taken place that I think we're seeing the direct result of today when it comes to, why our culture seems to be so obsessed with or focused on sex and sexuality. The first one, Shawn, I would say is this, the major shift being what is often referred to as the death of God. And by that, I don't mean that God's actually died.
Right.
But it was what some philosophers talk about is the loss of the transcendent, or the loss in our general consciousness of any notion that there's anything outside of the physical universe,
right?
I.e., divinity,
right,
or a God. I don't want to spend a lot of time on the history of Western thought. There's probably just a few key individuals whose ideas really, it's not like they were the only ones, but I would say their ideas deeply characterized this movement. The first was Darwin, right? Darwin, who, I mean, one of the things he said that I think is so telling, his final conclusion from all of his studies, he declared everything in nature is the result of fixed laws, right?
Right.
So we were so brilliant in the 19th century that we finally discovered that we can explain everything according to fixed natural laws. That was his conclusion.
Yeah.
Right? That very much became a world-shaping idea.
Yeah.
And very much drove, the rational scientific enterprise of the late 19th and early and 20th century.
Yeah.
Along with Darwin was Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche is the one who he declared God is dead in his philosophy work. Again, he didn't mean that literally God had died. What he meant was that the idea of God in Western culture is dead. We don't need God anymore as an explanatory framework. Right. He said, God is dead. He said, we, however, want to become who we are. Human beings who are unique and new and incomparable, who give themselves laws, who create themselves. And I think Darwin and Nietzsche just typified that Enlightenment, modern, rational rejection of the transcendent.
Right.
Nietzsche at least I think, was honest enough to see the direct implications of that. And that if there's no God outside of us who is giving meaning to the world, then Nietzsche hit the nail on the head. If there's nobody giving us meaning outside ourselves, then we have to give meaning to ourselves.
We got to figure it out ourselves. Yeah.
We have to create ourselves and give ourselves meaning, right? So that was the first major shift. And the other one, which is interesting because it was happening alongside of it at the same time, but almost in reaction to. And this was the inward turn for meaning. You had the Enlightenment where all these modern rationalists were thinking that we could use science and reason to determine life's meanings just by looking at the physical world and scientifically, discerning and evaluating. But there was a reaction to that among those who considered that there's an equally persuasive force in human nature, not just reason, but our passions, right? And so Romanticism was a movement that kind of emerged in reaction to this rationalistic move of the Enlightenment, and it had an equally persuasive influence, turning people's gaze inward to their own subjective experience and emotions as keys to unlocking what they became to see as their authentic self. And maybe the one who got the ball rolling on this was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Mm-hmm. And he was a philosopher, and he kind of was this man who began doing some thought experiments, and he wrote them out in his work called The Confessions. And he basically spent time just reflecting on how he could come to truly understand his authentic self. And here's the conclusion he came to. He said, "The particular object of my confessions is to make known my inner self, and all I need do in order to accomplish this, as I have done up until now, is to look inside myself."
Right.
So there's what I see are maybe the two most influential worldview shifts that we've inherited here in the West. Mm-hmm. The death of God, right? The idea that there's nothing outside of us giving us meaning. There's no one outside of us giving our lives meaning. And also then this inward turn, right? Searching for meaning, looking to our individual feelings and desires and emotions to discover our authentic self, who we really are.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's fascinating to me, Scott, is earlier we had talked about even these ancient sexual practices like the Kama Sutra, the cultic sex, all had to do with transcendence, right? So their worldview was transcendent, and that informed their sexual practices. Mm-hmm. So what we're talking about now is our worldview is this inward turn, right? The transcendence is gone, and so we're now looking within ourselves to find our meaning. Mm-hmm. So if that was our worldview, then what could we assume our sexual practices would look like? Like maybe we just kind of do a little thought experiment here, right? Move from ancient, sexual practices relevant to their worldview to what our worldview is. Like what does that look like?
Right. And certainly maybe along with that, think about then moving from, if we think about our Western culture, our understanding of transcendence was rooted in, again, the Judeo-Christian God. Right. Yep. So, yeah, you're right. Whether it's that pagan or ancient form of transcendence, or more recently and more relevantly for us, the Judeo-Christian one, exactly. Okay, yeah, let's do a thought experiment. Let's see what would happen if suddenly, now there is no transcendent.
Right.
There is no objective reality beyond the physical, giving meaning to the physical,
right?
Which means that sex and sexuality have no inherent eternal meaning outside of itself,
right?
Yeah. So what could you safely conclude? What kind of things could you safely conclude if you took that to be the case? Sex has no actual meaning.
No. Right. There's no connection to anything outside of myself. So sex just becomes about me, really, right? If that's where my meaning is, and everything else and there is no meaning transcendently from someone else about sex, then yeah, it's about me and my
Yeah.
sexual experience, I guess.
Well, and along with that, I think too, and again, this just follows logically. If there's no inherent meaning, and I think you're right, that means then my own experience of my sexuality becomes what is ultimately important to me. And if there's no
Right.
meaning outside of me or outside of us to tell us, then that means that no one really outside of myself can tell me or instruct me
Mhm.
or
Right.
or evaluate the experiences I'm having to say whether they are good or bad one way or the other.
Right. Because it's about
And
what I'm feeling and my experience, because that's the core truth.
right. And what
Mhm.
standard of evaluation would you be pointing to say
Right.
that my experience was not legitimate or proper or good for me?
Right. Right.
There,
This is
there
starting
wouldn't
to
be any.
explain a lot. This is starting to
Well, I mean, the more we talk, Sean,
yeah.
is it not sounding more and more like the sentiments that we hear around us all the time? Maybe we don't always take the time to think about those things,
Mhm.
but even going through that thought experiment, you see that,
Right.
well, actually, those sentiments that we're expressing as a culture are a logical outcome
Yeah.
of particular worldview beliefs.
Mhm.
It's not
Yeah.
just as we suggested earlier, it's not just that our culture's decided to loosen up moral restrictions. These changes haven't come from just some kind of a failure to hold the line,
Right.
morally speaking.
And this should help us, Scott, in terms of when we're talking to others about sexuality and our beliefs, that I think often, at least in the past, I have thought, we go back to, the laws and the rules and all that type of stuff.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
really, almost we need to even, take a couple steps even further back to what the worldview is, to the person
Yeah.
that we're talking to,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
This is really, opened my eyes to that.
It's interesting. I saw one of our Go partners, PTA Go partners, Mike McGarry, over at Youth Pastor Theologian. He posted something the other day. It was just a picture with a little inscription on it, but it was making a point. His point, what he said was that more and more in evangelism these days, we probably need to start with Genesis 1 and creation rather than John 3:16. And I don't think that doesn't in any way devalue, right, John 3:16 and the story of the cross and all those things. All that is, I think, is illustrating the point that we're making here, is that the worldview foundation of the people around us in our culture, of the culture around us, has shifted, right? It has a different foundation. When I, as a Christian, am talking and am trying to engage in a conversation about a biblical view of sexuality or a Christian sexual ethic with someone who doesn't share my beliefs, what I need to realize is that it's not that they just don't share my biblical sexual morality. It's that they don't share my worldview. They have a
Right.
completely different starting point from which to answer the most basic questions about life.
Mhm. Yeah.
And it's what's probably true is that in my conversation with them, even if the subject may be sexuality, where I need to direct the conversation is to the questions around worldview.
Right. Right. And it almost reframes then, the fear as Christians in our culture is, the question around homosexuality. Do you think homosexuality is a sin? Do you think it's wrong? Asked from someone from within the culture, directed to you, and often we stammer and are not sure what to say. This is kind of shedding light on maybe there's a different way to engage that conversation than at the sexual ethics level.
Well, sure, because packaged in or smuggled in with that question are hidden worldview assumptions.
Right. Right.
And so I think in a case like that, I mean, there's no, we don't have any script to give people what exactly to say. But you need to realize when someone challenges you, you're a Christian. Do you think homosexuality is a sin? I think the operative question to respond with is, what do you mean by sin?
Right. Exactly. Yes.
Because that is going to uncover, right? That's going to uncover the assumptions. Well, sin is an offense. Biblically, sin is an offense against God.
Right.
Well, who do you mean by God?
Right.
Right. We're whittling down. We're getting to the foundation.
To Genesis 1. We're getting back to Genesis 1.
Which is where you need to start if you're going to have a meaningful conversation, and not just argue over moral preferences or what will be perceived to be moral preferences.
Right.
And again, I think just maybe learning to have these conversations even amongst, ourselves as Christians will help us to start to think about them from more of a worldview standpoint, right? To understand that there's more behind them than just simply reiterating the biblical rules, so to speak, around sex and sexuality, but the beliefs that undergird them, the ultimate foundation.
Yeah. Okay, so great thought experiment, Scott, to kind of go back to that. Kind of makes sense now to what we're seeing in culture in relation to our worldview. So I guess the next question is, so what does this mean going forward? Like, what do we see happening or continuing or possibly getting worse?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to be, a doom and gloom naysayer kind of person, and I don't have a crystal ball. But just thinking through of the ideas that have brought us to where we are as a culture, and I guess the logical outflow of those ideas when it comes to then our choices and our justifications around sexual morality. Where do we see this going? And I'm just kind of following the trajectory that we already see, right? That is accelerating. I think the first thing we're going to continue to see as a society is we're going to see a continued move, culturally, to continue to break down boundaries around sexual morality. Or some sociologists like to use the word taboos. They talk about, what kind of taboos a society sets up for itself, and it's referring to sexual taboos. I think we're going to see the continued move to break down or eliminate taboos. For instance, taboos around things like pedophilia.
Yeah.
Lowering the age of consent, and there's a loaded word itself, the word consent, right? I've read a book that I've read that is just was a really helpful book to really unpack some of these movements in our cultural thought. Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It's been out for a few years now, but just an excellent work. But he made some astute observations. He said this, most people have not read Freud, but many find appealing the message preached in myriad of movies and soap operas that life is about finding individual sexual satisfaction and that one's sexual appetites lie at the very center of who one actually is. Now, that is textbook Freud.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But I think he's absolutely right that our culture has so anchored my sexuality and my, and my sexual desires and the fulfillment of those desires with my identity, that it's hard not to see then that how our culture will justify. Then we need to break down taboos that would restrict or limit people from their desires being ultimately fulfilled.
So that they can find who their authentic self is.
Yeah, I mean, that's the logical conclusion. I don't know how you get around it. Now, I think that itself also leads to what I see, what will follow that. The second implication, or the second thing we're going to see happening more and more, is a continued dehumanization of sex. We've constructed this very flimsy and hard to define, let alone apply, concept of consent, right? As if that's going to supply anything goes so long as there's consent.
Right.
right? As if that's going to protect us somehow from the, I guess, the ultimate degradation of sex into something horrible.
Right.
But I mean, okay, think about this, Shawn.
Hmm.
Even where consent can be, legitimately established, consenting with someone else to use each other as objects to bring ourselves, our own sexual gratification, it does nothing to minimize the fact that we are simply reducing each other to mere objects, even if there is consent. And that is ultimately dehumanizing. Shawn, for anyone to look at another person and see them as a mere means to an end, right? The end of my gratification. You've turned them into an object. You've turned them into a chair or a sofa or something else that I can use for my own personal well-being or comfort or whatever, gratification. And that's absolutely dehumanizing. The third thing then, the third thing I see happening, Shawn, then, is that we're going to see continued pressure on Christians, particularly Christian young people, to view biblical teaching on sexual morality as restrictive and oppressive. And you know what? It's already happening. Not that long ago, we had Josh Harris, right, the author of "I Kissed Dating Goodbye," kind of the quote unquote spokesmodel, just 15 or 20 years ago for the movement to encourage young people to remain chaste until they are married, to see courtship as a prelude to marriage. He basically came out and said he was wrong. That was all wrong. He turned from that, and really this is started a growing movement among evangelical Christians to consider chastity before marriage as maybe optional, or maybe at best optional, at worst an unrealistic goal or an unrealistic burden to lay upon anybody, any Christian. And, the data seems to support this. I came across a report by the Family Studies Institute. It shows that 65%, both of male and female Christian evangelicals between 18 to 22 years old, reported that they had had sexual intercourse outside of marriage.
Yeah.
Okay. So the data seems to show that is becoming a reality. And I think that's just going to continue to accelerate. Unless we as the church can, begin equipping and helping better disciple or more effectively disciple our young people into, Christian holiness. There are some encouraging movements in that direction, I'll have to say too. There's some great material that's starting to come out. There are some people who are becoming very vocal about it and really encouraging discipleship in the area of sexuality. I'm starting to hear among Christian young adults, a growing desire for faithfulness in that area. So I'm not a complete doom and gloomer, but again, right now, the data, the trajectory still seems to be moving in an upward direction.
So then, is this podcast series, is the content that we're producing, Scott, are we generally just going to come and say, stop having sex? Like, is that what we're talking about? Is this what we're moving towards? Because it sounds like it.
We should make that the title of this episode.
Right. Stop having sex.
No, that's not the purpose of this episode. It's not the purpose of this series, nor is it the purpose of our ministry. Shawn, what we want to do is help Christians to think biblically about all of life. And so in this subject, we want to help believers, especially the emerging generation, to think biblically about sexuality. The purpose of thinking biblically, the purpose of thinking like Jesus, is so that you can confidently live like Jesus.
Right.
As Paul said in Romans 12:2, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Right? God is terribly interested in the way we form and shape our thinking, the ideas and the beliefs that we hold in our hearts and our minds. So what we want to do is really to equip and encourage believers to gain or regain a biblical understanding of human sexuality, to see the beautiful thing that God created it to be.
Mm.
Right? When you say something like, are we just going to go out and say, stop having sex? That makes it sound like Christianity is a killjoy and we're just here to ruin the party, right? And that what Christian young people have to do is cling to faithfulness by their fingernails until Jesus comes back or takes them home, right? And that's the best that we can offer. No. What God gives us is the revelation of his true word, the truth about what he's created us to be and what he's created human sexuality to be.
Right.
And one of the things we're going to nudge against and maybe get into through this series, and certainly the material we're coming out with shortly, Shawn, is to help Christians see the beautiful thing that God has made sex to be by showing them what sex actually points us to. And again, this is what our culture is missing, is sex has become the end in itself. That the only thing I need to do is find gratification.
Yeah.
As much, as often, as quickly, as easily as I can, and that's where I'll find satisfaction. When the biblical view is, no. Human sexuality actually points to something beyond itself.
Right.
And what it points to is beautiful and eternal and glorious.
And Scott, I think that is a great place to conclude this episode and pointing to that beautiful thing. As we had mentioned at the start of the episode, we are producing a new series. In fact, it's called, and quite appropriately, So Much More Than Sex. That's what the series is called. We are really excited about this. And that series will provide you that foundation that Scott was just talking about, to dive deeper into what sexuality and what the Bible talks about sexuality and points to that beautiful thing. And so this is kind of a shout out to our listeners to get ready for that content, to almost in essence wet their whistle on it. But as always, we'd encourage listeners to send questions about anything that we've talked about today. We just kind of touched the surface on a lot of these things. So if there are questions, we'd love to follow up with it, as well as we do have content that Scott had mentioned that we have done in the past around different aspects of sexuality that you can find on our website. And before we wrap up, I want to apologize to my kids or any family that are listening and cringing as Dad talks about sex online. And this just occurred to me, maybe in the future, a grandchild watches or listens to an episode.
There's nothing cringeworthy about it.
No.
It's an important subject to talk
It is
about.
a very important subject, and we hope that it's blessed you. And as always, share, like, and subscribe, and we look forward to you joining us in our next episode. God bless.
You're listening to the Prepared to Answer podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and help us equip even more people to think like Jesus by sharing with your friends and family. If you have questions or comments regarding this episode or any other, feel free to email us at info@preparedtoanswer.org or contact us through Facebook or Instagram @Prepared to Answer.